She loves and she confesses too. There's then at last no more to do.
The Draughtsman's Contract is a 1982 British film written and directed by Peter Greenaway. This was the director's first mainstream feature film. Greenaway began his career editing documentaries for the UK government. He puts the beginning of his film career with a creation called Windows in 1975. He is probably best known for his post-Draughtsman's work, with his heyday being in the 1990s. His best-known film is probably the somewhat notorious Cook, the Thief, His Wife, and Her Lover in 1989, which was X-rated when initially released. He also directed Prospero's books in 1991 based on Shakespeare's Tempest, and The Pillow Book in 1995. The Draughtsman is set in rural Wiltshire, England, in 1694, during the reign of William III and Mary II. The action was shot on location in the house and formal gardens and maze of Groombridge Place. The cast is made up of Anthony Higgins as Mr. Neville, the Draughtsman, Janet Sussman as Virginia Herbert, Dave Hill as Mr. Herbert, her husband, Anne Louis Lambert as Sarah Talman, Ms. Herbert's daughter, Hugh Fraser as Mr. Talman, Neil Cunningham as Thomas Noyes, David Meyer as one of the Poulenc twins, and Tony Meyer as the other Poulenc twin, Nicholas Amer as Parks, Susan Crawley as Mrs. Pierpont, Linda LaPlante as Ms. Clement, Michael Feast as the statue, David Gant as Seymour, Alistair Cumming as Philip, Steve Hubels as Hoyton the Dutchman. The story. Mr. Neville, Anthony Higgins, is a young, arrogant draftsman contracted by Mrs. Virginia Herbert, Janet Sussman, to produce a series of 12 landscape drawings of her country house, its outbuildings and gardens, for her indifferent husband, who is about to depart on a 14-day business trip. They are obviously estranged, and he mocks his wife openly in the first scene, the prologue, telling Mr. Seymour, at a party, of his plans to engage in adulterous cavorting during the trip. Miss Herbert presents as being bothered by her husband's indifference, although a scene where she strokes the cheek of a lady-in-waiting with the side of her foot suggests, perhaps, another reason for the estrangement, and that perhaps Mr. Herbert is not the cause of the estrangement, or as much of a villain as he is portrayed to be in the initial scenes. Mr. Herbert very formally announces his departure to his wife at the same party, coolly warning her not to leave the grounds or drink his claret while he is away. Not atypically, for our times, the European male aristocrat is cast as the villain, as of the opening prologue. But are they really the villains? Part of the contract is that Mrs. Herbert agrees to meet Mr. Neville in private and to comply with his request concerning his pleasure with me. Although this comes off as being at Mr. Neville's demand, this is only true in the 2-hour edited-down version of the film for release. Apparently, in the uncut 4-hour version, which I have not seen, this term was clearly made by Mr. Neville in jest, to finally put an end to Ms. Herbert's persistence. It has the opposite effect, and she surprises him by accepting the demand. This is an important omission from the final version. What we see in the edited version casts Neville as a brute and opportunist, if not a sexual predator. At worst, he is a sexual opportunist, since he plays along, for which he is, of course, morally blameworthy. Yet they are both, of course, adulterers. Here again, the European male aristocrat or pretender is cast as a villain. So we have here a stereotype that carries through films like Titanic and Amadeus and many others in portraying the upper classes or the aristocracy as the barrier to natural progression of history and to its inevitable utopian climax. Several encounters between Mr. Neville and Mrs. Herbert follow, each indicating reluctance or distress on the part of Mrs. Herbert and sexual aggression or insensitivity on the part of Mr. Neville. As noted, Miss Herbert may have other reasons for her distress or indifference. Her disgust, however, does seem real enough. But also keep in mind that she accepted an adulterous term made in jest. So in this sense, she's an opportunist. An early scene shows Mrs. Herbert's married but childless daughter, Mrs. Talman, Anne Louis Lambert, is in fact the guiding force behind the contract, if not its surrogate. Her mother is in fact bait for the real plan of providing her with an heir. Mrs. Herbert's son-in-law, Mr. Talman U. Fraser, is impotent. During his stay, Mr. Neville becomes disliked by several of its visitors and inhabitants, especially by Mr. Talman. Mrs. Herbert, wearied of meeting Mr. Neville for his pleasure, tries to terminate the contract before the drawings are completed. When you understand the plot in retrospect, one can ask if this is pure pretense. Perhaps she knows this will only get her prey not only to take the bait, but to swallow it whole in fulfillment of her plan. It is unclear if her daughter is in on her reluctance and has to intervene to prevent the plan falling apart. Neville, of course, refuses and continues as before. Is Neville even free to choose at this point? In psychological terms, he is, of course, an artist, a mediocre one, albeit, whose ego is fully engaged in the completion of the project, if nothing else. He is undoubtedly amusing himself at this point. Then Mrs. Talman blackmails him into a second contract, in which he agrees to comply with her pleasure rather than his. The blackmail is contained in her alternative interpretation of the drawings, including a riderless horse, her father's shirt with a gash across its chest, all pointing to Mr. Neville's complicity in a misadventure. There are suggestions throughout that something odd is indeed going on within the view of the estate through the frame or grid of the draughtsman's point of view. Things appear that shouldn't be there. Things appear that weren't there before. Mr. Neville includes them in the drawings, putting his head into the noose. We know something is wrong when Mr. Herbert's body is discovered in the moat and placed on the ground at the base of the statue of a horse. We have learned at this point that Mr. Noyes was a failed suitor of Mrs. Herbert, and has stayed on as estate manager nonetheless. He confronts Mrs. Herbert with his quite legitimate fear that he is an obvious suspect in the murder of her husband. Mr. Talman confronts his wife in another scene with another interpretation of the drawings, that they seem to point to an adulterous relationship between her and Mr. Neville. She responds by pointing out they could also point to Mr. Talman's involvement in murder. The characters are being united in the singular purpose of falsely accusing Mr. Neville. Structurally, the film centers around the 12 drawings, as well as an incomplete 13th one. Mr. Neville completes his 12 drawings and leaves initially, but returns to make the unlucky 13th drawing. He is now wearing white, the other characters having switched to black. I would add that I began working on this movie review on Friday the 13th, which confirms my place very much outside the structuralist world of the director. In the evening, while Mr. Neville is apparently finishing the final sketch, he is approached by a masked man, obviously Mr. Talman in disguise, carrying a lantern, who is then joined by the estate manager and Mrs. Herbert's ex-fiancé, Mr. Noyes, neighbor Mr. Seymour, and the Poulencs. Mr. Talman accuses Mr. Neville of the murder of Mr. Herbert, for the drawings can be interpreted to suggest his involvement in more than one illegal act. When he denies the accusation, he is asked to remove his hat. He agrees mockingly and makes a grand French bow, a very vulnerable position, and his last affectation. At this point he is clubbed from behind, knocking him senseless, but not yet dead. A new contract is read out, the first term being the burning out of his eyes, which is apparently an Oedipal illusion. His garments are removed, representing a kind of loss of identity. The twins then finish him off with 2 consecutive club blows and throw him into the moat at the place where Mr. Herbert's body was found. This suggests a kind of substitution. We last see Mr. Neville's body floating face up in the water. The end. Greenaway has described the plot this way. The story hinges on the inclusion or exclusion of certain objects within the artist's drawings. He leaves them in, he is condemned. He leaves them out, he escapes. But Neville can't leave them out. Why? The issue relates, according to the director, to the wider question of whose authority and desires really lurk behind the draughtsman's contract. The film is essentially about a draftsman drawing a landscape, and the facets of the drawing and the landscape are compared on another level of representation, the film. I want those 3 ideas to be present in the whole structure of the movie, so that one is aware that we are making comparisons all the time between the real landscape, Mr. Neville's image of it, and ultimately us, as viewers, seeing those ideas represented on film. We are meant to identify here the relationship between the living author, Greenaway, and the inanimate world of his creations, between the world of subjects and objects. Greenaway has also stated, "The whole thing for me is an investigative procedure of approaching phenomenology on a very wide front." The narrative structure of the movie covers a number of themes according to Greenaway. It's set in 1694, a crucial time for English history, a transition from the world of the Catholic Stuart dynasty to the Protestant-inspired mercantile, nouveau riche aristocracy out of Northern Europe. It is a time of changing values, which Greenaway identifies as the perfect vehicle to fictionalize and invent characters and attitudes which he admits are not totally historically accurate, but do have some basis in historical fact. One area where he has taken license is in the status of the draftsman. By his manners and dress and cockiness, and even the fact he is invited to the opening party, you would take the draftsman to be an equal, or at least a spectrum aristocrat. In fact, historically, a draftsman in England at the time would have been considered of no more importance than, say, the head of the stables. However, in Northern Europe, there is evidence that draftsmen such as Mr. Neville at the time may well have been received in a manner we see in the movie. So in the broader European context, the movie isn't entirely implausible in this sense. Greenaway has chosen Wiltshire, away from London and Bristol, so it is conceivable a more continental attitude to the draftsman may have prevailed away from the influence of major English cultural centers. But keep in mind, this is not a historical film. Greenaway is unusual among movie makers for his stated disdain for cinema, at least in how it is practiced. He came to movie making indirectly through the Walthamstow Art School. He managed to get a temporary job at the Central Office of Information, which sounds like the Ministry of Propaganda. In fact, Greenaway described it as the propaganda arm of the British Foreign Office. Propaganda, yes, but not at the highest levels. he rose up the ranks from sweeping the floor to editor and director. What he ended up making were films on British industrial, agricultural, and cultural life to show in classrooms around the world. The topics included the number of sheepdogs in Wales. One can almost hear the metal cases containing the film reels being opened at the back of the classrooms of the day, the lights going out, and the projector starting its hum. What this propaganda did for him was blur the lines between fact and fiction. He experienced firsthand the lack of fit between geographical terrain and activities, on the one hand, and the maps, lists, and classificatory schemes used to explain and control natural phenomena on the other. This is happening in the 60s under the prevailing structuralist and semiological ideas of the time. Structuralism is the intellectual movement and philosophical orientation often associated initially with the Western discourses of Levi Strauss, Marx, and Althusser, for example, who claimed to analyze and explain invariant structures in and constitutive of nature, society, and the human psyche. Structuralism is a mode of knowledge of nature and human life that is interested in relationships rather than individual objects. It is worth setting out a definition of structuralism, as we clearly see its influence in how Greenaway films are put together, or rather constructed, with hidden underlying patterns, forms, themes, which he sees as being more important than the narrative. Structuralism is a philosophy and method that developed from insights in the field of linguistics in the mid-20th century to study the underlying patterns of social life. In the social sciences, the structuralist mode of inquiry sought not simply to identify structures or relationships per se, but rather to look behind or beneath the visible and conscious designs, beliefs, ideas, behaviors of active human subjects, surface manifestations, to expose or unearth how those designs are in fact outputs, effects, consequences, products generated by underlying causes, hidden mechanisms, or a limited number of deep structures that are universal to the human mind. The structuralist approach was invented and developed by several key thinkers, such as Saussure, Levi Strauss, Lacan, Barthes, Foucault, and many others across several disciplines. On the surface of his films, we have Greenaway, the fine artist. He is visibly at work in his films, but not only as director. In The Draughtsman, the sketches you see drawn in the movie ostensibly by Neville are in fact Greenaway at work. Greenaway, unlike a Woody Allen, doesn't fetishize cinema as a unique, distinct, even superior art form, as nauseating as this can be in a Woody Allen film. Greenaway is very much at the other extreme. It is mere cinema to him, a step in a continuum of image-based media. In his many interviews, he repeatedly asserts that he wishes above all to bring the aesthetics of painting to filmmaking and to diminish the influence of narrative. The deliberate, thoughtful visual quality of Draughtsman can be traced back to the late 17th century paintings of Caravaggio, as well as the Venetian painter Antonio de Crevalcore and the German painter living in Naples under the Italian name Desiderio. We also see the influence of de la Tour, the late Raphael, and the Baroque painter Nicolas Poussin. Greenaway is attracted to the Baroque as a period where art contemplates itself, very much a Greenaway affectation. The influence of Dutch painters is perhaps even more dominant, and we are thinking here of the famous interiors. To Greenaway, and Godard before him, Dutch painting was a forerunner to cinema. Godard described Vermeer as the first cinematographer because he used the camera obscura. Some of these compositions move consciously into the film, sometimes with blasphemous results. Two compositions are integral to the film and center around the signing of the sexual contract. They are based on the painting by Georges de la Tour, which were originally depicting the Virgin Mary and Mary Magdalene. The 2,000 years of Western painting interest me more than the last 100 years of film. Greenaway has said he won't lose sleep over the death of cinema because painting will last forever. Language is also form, and here the formalized language of the Draughtsman is also based on the language of the time, as we can find in contemporary playwrights such as Sheraton and Congreve. But again, this isn't copying or a history lesson. Draughtsman stands out as the first of Greenaway's films that was, as he described it, over-scripted. This is addressed in the movie by the highly formalized language. The language, like the images, like music, is part of the structure, not just the means by which the story is told or character is developed, or character types are identified in the ordinary movie-making way. An issue throughout the film is the idea of authorship. Who is talking? The character? The writer? The director? Who is the audience hearing? Greenaway adapts the language, such as Congreve, to the modern ear so as not to create an impediment to hearing or listening. There are many differences between how people would actually have spoken in 1694, or perhaps better put, how the playwrights of the time would have written. Key is that the film Draughtsman is not, again, a historical costume drama. We are participating in a film which is aware of 20th century idioms and resonates to the 20th century. There is an expression that everything exists to be put in a book. Greenaway paraphrases this in his films. To him, everything exists to be put into a list. Obviously, you can see the influence here of his early days as a UK propagandist, making movies about sheepdogs. To the director, lists are a fiction, a way humans organize reality. As in Dr. Zhivago, Lara ended up on a list that was subsequently misplaced. So will we all. History, in turn, doesn't exist either. It is a kind of list called history. The list maker is the victor. Who are on the list of war criminals? Who is on the list of Nobel Prize winners? These lists determine reality. Greenaway has also spoken about the history of mapmaking and how it really comes down to relative perceptions. Good art, in Greenaway's understanding of it, has to be artificial and call attention to itself as a construct. As he said in an interview with Gavin Smith in 1990, "My cinema is deliberately artificial, and it's always self-reflexive. Every time you watch a Greenaway movie, you know you are definitely and absolutely only watching a movie. It's not a slice of life, not a window on the world. It's by no means an exemplum of anything natural or real. I do not think that naturalism or realism is even valid in cinema." Greenaway is fascinated with the artificial systems by which man organizes his world. He acknowledges that the heroes in his films are surrogates for himself. He is the draftsman, but also the architect, the cook, the scientist, the game players, Prospero the magus, the calligrapher. The artist's role is finding order in chaos. That's what civilization is about. What you see playing out for you in the film is a mediocre artist confronted with a dilemma he cannot resolve. He sees, he draws, but the wheels of his mind are turning independently. But he cannot bring the two together. The obsessively fastidious draftsman is torn between drawing what he sees and what he knows. We all know many draftsmen and women. Take the pandemic of 2020, 2021, and ongoing. It's all there to be seen, to be understood, to know, but the mediocre can't put the pieces together. They just keep obeying the formalities, the hidden structures of a civilization that is turned on them, but they are prisoners. They have to play their parts to the end and cannot escape it. The draftsman may suspect he is being set up. He may even escape for a time, as he does in the movie. He does manage to leave, but then he has to come back. Why? Unseen forms and structures require him to return to paint the 13th sketch. He does, and he dies. It was always going to happen. He isn't free. He is on a ride at an amusement park. Or was he supposed to escape and disorders the form and structure by returning? Does this mean he is actually rebelling against the structure? An interesting aside, Greenaway, who calls himself an atheist, has said the only real immortality is children. Well, consider that the heir to the estate at the end of the movie will be the draftsman's child. So who gains immortality? Who is the winner? Who died in the moat? Who only seems to be dead? He sees modern movie making, even the avant-garde, as stagnant. Movie making in the hands of most directors is a highly conventional art form, most likely because films are so hard to finance and produce that convention wins out over innovation. One could say movie making still hasn't reached cubism and may become extinct before it does so. Cinema, to Greenaway, hasn't changed much at all in 100 years. It is simply the illustrating of 19th century psychodramas invented in the novels of the time. He regards most film as ineptly made and almost unwatchable. If you want a story, read a book. He gives the example of The English Patient. The movie is nothing more than an illustration of a highly redacted version of the book. There's no other existence. It would be interesting to ask Greenaway how he regards the film like The Shining, which was hated by the author, Stephen King, and which is quite obviously an independent work of art as film. I expect he would say it is well made and interesting, but still a psychodrama and nothing more. Greenaway avoids psychodrama entirely. In Draughtsman, a sexualized murder mystery, the obvious method would be to focus on the drama and character. There is precious little of that in the film. To the extent it exists, it is supplied by the expectations of the viewer, even though it isn't actually there. It is like that famous scene in Rosemary's Baby where the position of the camera causes the entire audience to lean to the side to see around the corner. But in fact, the tools of drama are left out. There are no close-ups, or even many medium shots that go hand in hand with standard mainstream or even avant-garde cinema. The actors and landscapes appear on the painter's tableau and remain so. As a painter who makes movies, Greenaway consciously considers aspect, ratio, proportion, size, frame according to content. To be human is to experience the world in the frame of our visual field. The painting is both highly artificial and yet at the same time reflects the reality of our mortal existence, experiencing the world through our visual field as interpreted by our fallible mind. One of the essential conceits of the Draughtsman is that the camera does not move. There are 3 reasons for this according to Greenaway. 1. Painters don't move. 2. With a still camera, you throw the influence on the dialogue and the soundtrack. It is extremely important that all the words are heard and listened to. There are puns, conundrums, wordplays, and red herrings. 3. He is a reactionary. In his view, most camera work is done in almost all movies for no good structural reason, or even any good emotional reason. In mundane cinema, it is just wide shot, medium shot, close-up. Wide shot, medium shot, close-up. But even in better quality work, the desire to keep the camera on the move, in his view, is often unnecessary. One place you see the camera move in The Draughtsman is during the dinner scenes, where it moves from left to right and back. He has said he doesn't want audiences just sitting there watching. He has accepted the label structuralist, but he is also an entertainer. He wants people to be caught up in the intellectual games of his films. Greenaway has said he admires artists who play tricks, such as the trompe-l'œil, an art technique in which realistic imagery is used to create the optical illusion that the depicted objects exist in 3 dimensions. I want to use the story as a vehicle to explore tricks of culture, tricks of the cinema, tricks of painting. But does he believe everything is a trick? Is there nothing solid underneath? Is he a pure pessimist nihilist? I would say in his defense that there is no question, because of the quality of his work and his wit, that a person who is neither a pessimist nor a nihilist can participate productively in his films. For our own sake, the drama is contained in form, of image, language, and music, in manners, in the static and silence that is in fact how we experience life, but also how we experience a painting. There is the suggestion of a scream, but we only hear it in our minds, if at all. It is the drama of being alone in a windswept cornfield, as I remember it. The period setting is reflected in Michael Nyman's score. Nyman is a friend of the director and collaborated in many of his works, including Draughtsman. The music is an integral part of the form and structure. The director and Nyman try to evolve a system whereby the music and the visuals are created simultaneously, and each has its own independent life. The music is based on English composer Henry Purcell, and also Handel, who both wrote at a time when music had a great deal in common with modern systemic music, which is based on layers, repetitions, cyclic movement within the use of notes. Nyman takes certain phrases, certain note structures from Purcell, and integrates them into the form of the movie. In a subsequent joint effort for television, called Making a Splash, Greenaway attempted to tie the images with the music of Nyman together without using words. This linking is more evident in Draughtsman, but the words do not get in the way. They are independent. Greenaway is in some ways a good postmodernist, in that he isn't about pure annihilation. His works typically and overtly show affection for classicism and classical structure. Something of the West is preserved, integral. He follows the tradition of classical drama in that his films typically end with the death of the hero. They follow the structure of grand opera, a prologue, 3 acts, and an epilogue, or alternatively, the 19th century model of 3 acts. He describes his working methods as Apollonian and rational, and his stories as very classical. European culture permeates his films. He attributes this to his classical English education. There is also a very human and very English or Welsh attachment to domestic landscape. He makes ready use of allegory and symbolism, like the pomegranate scene in The Draughtsman, where Mrs. Herbert ominously explains to Neville the unintended, or perhaps intended, significance of his gift to her of a fruit, the juice of which is often likened to human blood and regeneration. She responds by offering him a pineapple, which he has opened at the time of his murder. In Europe, the fruit is a symbol of prosperity, wealth, and eternal life. Is this mockery or a reference to the draughtsman's biological immortality? The statue takes a bite into the pineapple at the end. There is another interesting meaning, in that it is now taken as a symbol of feminism, since adopted by the famous fashion designer Stella McCartney in the 2000s. But this is long after the film was made, unless Greenaway himself has the sight. When the statue gorges himself on the pineapple, is he mocking the symbol? Is he negating it? There is something cannibalistic about that closing scene, reminiscent of the cook thief. Another symbol is Mr. Herbert's riderless horse, and the raising of Herbert's body from the moat. The theme of inheritance and the Oedipal myth percolates under the surface. Who is the father? Who killed him? Whose child will inherit? There is also the use of the number 11 in the movie, which has some interest apparently as binary to structuralists, as in the 1 plus 1, but also as visually taking the shape of two towers in the 11. The binary is the foundational principle of semiotics, an investigation into how meaning is created and how meaning is communicated. To deep dive into this, read Levi Strauss or start with a paper by Paul Fry considering whether the Draughtsman is structuralist or in fact anti-structuralist. Levi Strauss argues that the underlying question answered by the Oedipal myth, as indeed by all myth, is the question of two or one. I won't get into that here, but look for the binary in the film. The number 11, the twins, the ladder, two fathers, one father, and perhaps no father. Interestingly enough, the twins, standing side by side, kill Neville at the end with 2 club blows to the head. Is this a reference to the 11? Structuralism, as executed in a film like The Draughtsman, may seem more like a Where is Waldo than anything too profound, but I am no structuralist. A film has to stand on its own, and if you have to explain that it is great, or you would understand that it is great, if only you could understand the hidden structures, then it probably isn't great. Fortunately, that isn't necessary, and The Draughtsman is great, much like a classical sonata is great in the hands of a Haydn or Mozart, even if you don't understand the sonata allegro form. If there is a truism in Western art, or even Western culture and civilization, it is that we believe form improves the finished result. Too much emphasis on form creates tedium. In Draughtsman, he has avoided this. Greenaway's work, The Cook Thief, has been described as a throwback to the English literary and satirical essay tradition of the 18th century. Swift, Sterne, Pope. But this is only an imperfect illusion. The closer comparison is Painter, a painter working in cinema. The satirist is also a destroyer, like the postmodernist. As in classical drama, Greenaway ensures every action is pushed to its conclusion. He acknowledges that nature has a hidden symmetry, which he calls a paradox, to the point where many true events are literally stranger than fiction. The movie plot appears to be a conspiracy of women against men, That is unquestionably what comes out of the 2-hour version, although Greenaway has been quoted as saying, "Everyone is in on it, except Neville, of course. Everyone had a reason to kill Neville, and one should perhaps answer the question of who killed Mr. Herbert by using the methods of a detective in the Murder on the Orient Express. But we must assess the film like any painting on its own merit, not after reviewing the early sketches. What we are left with when assessing the female characters in the film is a prototype of postmodernist banalities about Western civilization and patriarchy, which was certainly not intended at the time, I do not believe. Western man is a fraud. He thinks he is in charge, but he is impotent, like Mr. Tallman. A fool, like the statue. An unfaithful, even malicious husband, like Mr. Herbert. A sexual sadist, like Mr. Neville. Or a shallow, materialistic homosexual opportunist, like the twins. You see this again in costume dramas since the 1930s. The last time men in powdered wigs were seen as what they were: masculine, heroic, intelligent, confident, seasoned. There are always exceptions, but you show your bias by what you regard as the rule and what you regard as the exception. In the postmodern world and its war against patriarchy, the man is the fool, or the fake, and the woman is authenticity, pulling the strings, and deservedly so. Wiltshire needs to open its borders and diversify. If the women were in charge, there would be harmony. Although ask who is actually in charge, or if this world of 2021 isn't exactly what the Draughtsman predicted a matriarchy would be like: implicit, inferential, homicidal, and culturally suicidal. This is not the narrative on female power we inherited. This narrative only emerges like Venus from a clam with women's suffrage and the rapid rise of women's rights movements in the 19th and 20th centuries. In Greek drama, female madness and violence and homicidal tendencies is already fully developed. Western culture is full of other warnings concerning female cupidity, weakness, irrationality, even stupidity. There is bias here, certainly, but then with postmodernity, we have new biases against our male ancestors, which are at least equally suspect, I think less so. What you can see in the female characters in the Draughtsman is the emergence almost fully formed of the Western woman as traitor to Western civilization. One could say we are living this out in its fully developed form in real time in 2021. Throughout the West, women have risen to positions of power and authority everywhere. And never before under this leadership has Western civilization been weaker, more decadent, and closer to complete collapse and the annihilation of memory. Is that just history? Solar flares? Climate change? Or in fact, is that inherent in this form of female power? Or in the decline of male power and authority that goes with it? Well, we obviously can't just blame women. Women cannot abuse power unless their effeminate men or gimps have failed to participate fully in the civilization. These men cheer them on, as Western nations make one catastrophic error after another, culminating, in my humble view, in the stay safe narrative of the pandemic. Whether it be political correctness, the burning of books, the tearing down of statues, the banning of classical literature and music, eternal lockdowns, open borders, and the technocratic, managerial, therapeutic, anarcho-terrorist state. Key leadership positions are now being played by women, who are both thrilled and exhilarated by the achievement, and seemingly oblivious to the horrific repercussions in equal measure. We are all, in that sense, being clubbed, having our eyes burned out, and tossed in the moat. Greenaway's critics have accused him of championing female supremacy, but others have accused him of misogyny for his depiction of violence and rape. His true perception of women appears, interestingly enough, in a work he planned, but as far as I know, he has never completed. It was to be based on the Medea, in which a woman murders her own child. The concept seems rooted in the unintended and malicious impact of abortion culture on the female character, the pursuit of untrammeled freedom of the female without regard to the consequences. We see this playing out in the modern world today, populated by homicidal, totalitarian females with their fingers on the button. And then we must ask, are the intelligent women who hoodwink the draftsman intelligent, or simply evil? They are, of course, murdering an innocent man. Or if his guilt is sex crime, that was a setup as well, wasn't it? Greenaway has a fascination with twins and binary, as noted. You can see this in other works of his, like The Falls from 1980. In Draughtsman, we have the strange powdered Aristo twins, who are nothing if not a stereotype of Western decadence. Greenaway says his fascination is also related to the Platonic idea of one half seeking the other and encountering oneself in the mirror. There is a very explicit mirroring by the twins early in the film where they suddenly and dramatically complete a sentence together in unison. It is very effective foreshadowing of a similar episode at the very end when they blurt out in unison the concluding term of Mr. Neville's contract of death. Twins are also opposites. They are competitive. One represents decay and death, the other growth and life. Everything is based on the number 2 and the lateral divide. We all have lateral divides. Each of us is divided in 2. Even while walking, we have 2 lateral hemispheres. The mirror suggests echoes and reflections. Greenaway, the postmodernist, has expressed a number of banalities about man's destruction of nature, which in the context of the 1990s was a fairly sensible position. But viewed through the framing of 2021 with the religion of global warming, COVID, and the technocratic therapeutic state, seems very naive. On the other hand, he has been quoted as describing the AIDS epidemic as a moral sickness, although what he meant exactly isn't clear to me. He is undoubtedly correct that man has a complex relationship with nature, and that is certainly reflected in his movies. His postmodernist attitude, structuralism, and leftist naivetés do create internal limitations as to what he can create in a movie. You can only deconstruct so much until you have achieved chaos, and then there is nothing more to say. You pull back before that point, and then try something different. This may very well have turned him away in around 2000 from a recognizable film career, and sent him back to the world of pure art, which is where he ended up. I won't go into his career post-2000. You can look that up. But it does read like something happening on the 4th floor of your local museum of art that few people see. The aim of postmodern art, as stated by practitioners like Greenaway, if it has an aim other than to destroy, is to show the how and not the what. It must, in Greenaway's view, be self-referential. He is not trying to show the truth, but the little secrets as to how humans have configured the world. One could point out to Greenaway that postmodernist art seems very good at taking things apart, but is not so good at putting them back together. Postmodernists deal with those aspects of the past that don't fit the narrative by erasing them. The past doesn't hurt if you don't think about it. He calls himself an atheist, which I've always found incomprehensible in anyone with even below average intelligence. But perhaps, in the intelligent, atheism is an affectation like a powdered wig. A pronouncement that the wearer is going to remain impenetrable to you, except on his own terms. To Greenaway, there are only really two themes in contemporary cinema: copulation and death. He sees this evoked in a painting by Vermeer, a moment that will soon enough be erased and in time annihilated. The belief in Europe is that art is a way to achieve immortality. Greenaway mocks that notion. The hope will fail. There will be stagnation, decay, and death. Of course, those immortalized by Vermeer on canvas still look back at us. Greenaway's influences in cinema are Antonioni, Pasolini, Godard, and René. Although The Draughtsman has been compared to Kubrick's Barry Lyndon, and others have even seen hints of Tom Jones, which is frankly ridiculous. These are very superficial comparisons. Barry Lyndon is a very rigid attempt, in my view, to bring an actual 18th century novel to life. One feels the film is actually being directed by someone from the 18th century, with its moral codes, people of long attention spans, and subtle sense of humor, which of course has driven many moderns absolutely mad trying to watch it. It seems slow, dull, frustrating to idiot moderns. But in the end, it is what Greenaway despises, providing images to the written work. Tom Jones is pure narrative, with conventional camera work, and has more in common with vaudeville. Both these films are based on novels by Henry Fielder. Greenaway is clear that although the place and time in Draughtsman is post-Restoration England, the perspective is entirely modern. We are meant to see it as moderns, not travel back in time and live it. For Greenaway, the temperament of the movie is derived much more from French cinema. For example, movies such as Alain René's Last Night at Marienbad, or Eric Rohmer's The Marquise von O. And also take a look again at Fellini's Casanova. Greenaway has said he has always preferred to look towards continental Europe. The Draughtsman received the Grand Prix of the Belgian Film Critics Association. However, Greenaway has been criticized as a pessimist, a disengaged aesthete, an elitist, with his work overweighted with learned references to classical art. John Borman has attacked Greenaway's cruelty, coldness, and awesome sterile certainty. The experience of watching a Greenaway movie has been described as a nightmare art history seminar. He has also been described as being cool, intellectual, and an exhibitionist. From Greenaway's perspective, cinema is stagnant and needs reinvigoration. He has said that the last interesting cinema was by the Germans Fassbinder, Herzog, and Wenders in the 1970s. If a work like The Cook Thief expresses his disgust at contemporary Western material culture, then that's a good thing, and should save him from the fate of the deadbeats of postmodernism and globalism. He has described narcissism as the disease of the 20th century, which ties him to the tradition of Western ethics and separates him from the narcissistic movements that dominate the West today, which regard the narcissistic victim, ignorant, present-loving buffoon, consumer of his own excrement, as the ideal citizen. Although he is seen as postmodernist, and perhaps even sees himself as one, he is also in love with Western civilization, as noted. How does one explain the contradiction? The answer may be that he is not really postmodernist at all, but that his art is in fact an echo of the pessimistic, fatalistic, even nihilistic Jacobean culture in England, Think of the melancholic and funeral work of John Donne and others. One of the oddities, or perhaps obscenities, in the cut-down version of the movie is the statue. This is in fact a man, identity unknown, who has painted his naked body to look like a statue and assumes various poses throughout the estate. Who is he? He even poses as a urinating figure in a water fountain and must have consumed a lot of water to execute that scene. Greenaway doesn't concern himself with nudity in his films, treating it in the same way a painter would, as a simple object. This is obviously hard to digest for a Puritan North American market, where any frontal nudity must be sexual. If you want to see nudity digested, I would refer you to The Cook, the Thief, His Wife, and Her Lover, Greenaway's 1989 film, in which characters eat dog excrement, actually chocolate pudding apparently, and dead lovers are served up for dinner. In the uncut version of The Draughtsman, the statue has a wife and a dog. In the released version, the statue is obviously known to at least some of the characters, such as the draftsman's servant, as in one scene he is shooed away like a pesky raccoon. Greenaway says the statue is in fact informed by two conceits. In Northern Europe, and particularly in England, it was fashionable to have in your garden hollow statues made of lead and hooked up to the local water supply. The idea was to spray unsuspecting guests strolling through the garden with water. This was rollicking 17th century humor. The second conceit is that England, after a long period of turmoil and strife, was at last settling down to a period of prosperity, and the sons of landed gentry were being sent abroad to complete their education. This was the grand tour that included Greece and Rome, and the custom was to bring back statues and other works of art. But from what little we have seen of Mr. Herbert, he appears to be a stingy, mean-spirited fellow that Greenaway imagines was too cheap to bring back an actual classical statue, and instead has chosen to pay one of his workers to play the part. This is probably why people in the Herbert entourage are aware of the conceit and shoo him off occasionally. Probably because you aren't impressing anyone if you know the conceit. It is also a wink at the audience, a reminder that this is, after all, just a movie. But in terms of the postmodernist feminist tocsin of the movie, it would also once again demonstrate Western man or Western aristocracy isn't in fact the best, which it is, but rather the worst, and of course, an exploiter and even enslaver of the masses. Although it certainly seems the statue is enjoying himself until the last scene. In the end he cries, or at least slouches over on the horse as if crying, suggesting he is in on the plot. A Greenaway film, like The Draughtsman, is commendable in lacking sentimentality, but it also lacks typical narrative pleasures. It offers no solutions, no intimacy, and no condolences. His films go against the grain of deodorizing, romanticizing attitudes towards sex and death in most cinema. Just as history is written by the victors, so is cinema. For this reason alone, his films are inviting, as we may enter and do not find ourselves in fully occupied territory. Whether you can actually find yourself here, heaven or hell, or anything else for that matter, is an open question. But you remain free to leave, which is a unique and refreshing pleasure for our time.